So we've got Keith Banks joining us this evening to talk about his book, Drugs, Guns and Lies, My Life as an Undercover Cop. Welcome.
Thanks, Bianca. Nice to be here.
Good to meet you.
And you.
Now, just tell me a little bit about, firstly, before we get into it, what made you write the book?
A couple of things. I'd been wanting to write, excuse me, and tell this story for quite some time, ever since I lived it, really. But I started writing not chronologically, just certain stories, I guess, that I'd lived through, because I'd realised in the last sort of 3 or 4 years that I had what I now know to be chronic PTSD. So, growing up, my daughters, although both of them have not. Both of them have said that it was never a problem, but I realised that growing up, I just wasn't emotionally available all the time. That I certainly had what I now know to be classic symptoms of PTSD: joyless, sadness, short-term anger, and that myriad of emotions. So I really wanted to write something down to give to them, and I never wrote with the intention of publishing. I simply wrote. And I found the more that I did it, the more cathartic it became.
So what led to the PTSD? So it looks like it's just frozen a little bit. So we'll just see if... sorry, Keith, it just froze for about 10 seconds. So if you were talking, we didn't hear you. So I just asked what led to the PTSD, because you said it started when you were young. So is this before your work? Is it because of the work?
No, it was. It's certainly a result of policing.
Yes,
certainly,
okay.
And I was involved after the time frame that this book is set in. I was involved in some shooting incidents. I was involved in a situation where a colleague of mine was killed, and other fairly challenging situations, and that I guess that exacerbated the PTSD, and it's quite a common thing that occurs in human beings that are involved in trauma. So it really manifested itself, as I say, when my daughters were born after I left the police force, but during their childhood, I was suffering from what I now know is PTSD. So I just wanted to write, as I said, and chronicle something to give to them, so that I guess I could help them understand who I'd been and what had caused it. And then the writing just took on a life of its own, and I never expected to get to this stage where it was published.
So have you always sort of liked writing? Because it was a good read. Like, I feel like, it seemed to come naturally to you.
Yeah, I certainly have to give credit to my co-author, Ben. Ben, I met just through a total coincidental situation in a pub, and anyone who knows me would realise that that's not uncommon. I actually collect people when I'm out. It's one of the attributes I think that being an undercover cop taught me. But
really? It's an interesting way of putting it, collect people. So you like people, you like talking, getting to know their story.
Yeah, I do. I travelled for around 20 years for work after I left the police force, and I travelled by myself, and it wasn't unusual for me to, I call it collect people, but to meet people and have a network of friends wherever I went. But no, I've always loved writing. English, when I was at school, was certainly my favourite subject. And so when I wrote, Ben, my co-author, was able to, I guess what I call it, create word pictures and really give the writing some sense of cadence and make it, probably a little smoother, I guess. But I certainly wrote from the heart. I was very lucky, Bianca, that I'd kept all of my undercover notebooks, and anyone who reads the book will see the conversation. The conversation is as it happened. It was taken directly from notes that I made after all of my drug operations.
So was that part of the job, or you did that just to make sure you didn't forget anything, or was it like a cathartic thing also to sort of release what you'd experienced? A bit of both?
No, it was quite simply, pure and simply evidence taking. So if I were, for instance, if I were to meet you and I was to buy drugs from you, whichever, heroin, speed, acid, marijuana, whatever, I would conclude the deal. Then I'd go back to a safe place somewhere and I'd write notes of our conversation, and it would literally be, I said, you said, I said, you said, as best as I could recall. Because when operations were concluded and people were charged with drug trafficking or drug supply, I would have to give evidence in the event that they pleaded not guilty, which was another interesting part of our world. Whilst we were deep undercover, at the conclusion of every major operation or every operation we did, our identity was disclosed. So we moved all around Queensland to try and stay one step ahead of people who may recognise us.
So you, someone came to your school to talk about the police academy, and that's what got you interested in becoming a member of the academy to start off, before you did undercover work?
Oh, long before I did undercover work, yeah. I was torn between the police force and the defence force. So I had a love of the defence force through the Army cadet system at high school, and I had a very challenging home life.
Yes.
So I needed to get away from that home life as quickly as possible. I'd always wanted to be in some sort of occupation that served or protected people, and we literally had a police recruiter who came to the school, and I realised that I could leave home and complete year 12 at the police academy, and in my particular personal circumstances, that was very attractive. So that's what I did.
So do you attribute this sort of line of work solely to what you experienced as a child? You know, obviously wanting to be in a role that you're helping people, you want to be the best version of yourself, all of that sort of thing, you know, rules and just doing good for the community, giving back.
That's how it started. Yeah. That's absolutely what it was, and it was quite an idealistic night on a white charger approach and philosophy, I guess, that I had at that age at 17. And certainly as I've matured through life and I've realised, and through a lot of self-analysis and through a lot of counselling that I've been to, and I'm very open about PTSD. I think people should be. I've realised that that I was continually trying to prove to myself that I wasn't the frightened, scared child. And we all are a product of our childhoods. So certainly the risks that I took, the fact that I volunteered for all of the exciting and the dangerous things that I did, probably goes back to that to a certain extent.
So just for the listener, if you could just tell us very briefly about your childhood, just to put it in context.
Yeah, my mother divorced my father when I was quite young. I didn't know him, and she remarried a man when I was 6 who was an unskilled labourer, and that's okay. But he had a real problem with anger and alcohol. So I grew up in an environment where he was both physically and mentally abusive to me. He was certainly the same to my mother. And so I grew up, experiencing a lot of domestic violence and a lot of childhood trauma. And I made a decision quite early in my life that I wanted, as I said before, to do something that would help protect people from predators. Is the easiest and most simple way I can describe it.
Yes, and it really does make sense, doesn't it? When you sort of look back at things and why we make certain decisions and what our life experiences lead to what we choose in life. Absolutely.
Yep. So I joined the academy for 2 reasons. One was to escape that environment, and the second was to really move into what I saw as a noble profession, even though in those days policing wasn't well regarded, particularly in Queensland under the Bjelke-Petersen regime. That didn't matter to me because I knew that I could be myself and I could affect, I thought, or I wanted to affect change from within. All of those wonderful ideals that you have as a 17-year-old person.
Yeah, you were so young when you got involved in this.
I was, yeah. So I did 2 years in the academy. I was sworn as a 19-year-old police officer, and in hindsight, I think 19 was way too young. And I did the classic general uniform duty, etc. And then realised one night that we had undercover police. I never knew that undercovers existed. And from the time I realised that, I made every effort I could to volunteer for it and become one of those. And I was successful within 2 or 3 months, I think.
So how long were you trained for that job? It wasn't a lot of training, was it?
There was no training.
It was just a sort of learn as you go. I recall you saying in the book as well. But wasn't there a little bit of something that they were saying, do this, do that?
Well, in reality, the only unofficial or informal training that I had was I was paired up with an undercover agent who'd been doing the work for maybe 2 years, and I spent probably 3 or 4 weeks hanging around with him or tagging along and trying to absorb as much as I could. So there was no training course, which, back in those days, policing was a different world, and it was fairly rough and ready in a number of situations. And undercover, if you looked as unlike a typical policeman as you could, so I was a baby-faced little guy. Most cops were in there, over 180 centimeters tall. I was lucky to make 175, and so if you had that physical image or that physical appearance that was unpolice-like, that was probably half the battle.
Yeah.
So yeah, it was very, very learn as you go.
So I did recall you saying as well that you need to do your. Someone told you about method acting. It's a bit like method acting, and you had to change your language and swear more. You're a bit too sort of nice to start off with, and you get a bit with the language, drop a few F-bombs and etc.
Yeah, I was actually a very nice, polite young kid. Remembering I was 21 years old when I started undercover work. So that was the feedback from everybody I knew. I had to, I spoke in a certain way, but, very much like I do now. And so I had to change that mode. I had to, I had to work on my language. I had to roughen up and just be more of an unpleasant character, really.
It's really interesting because, we can't fake things like that, and these people that you were dealing with, they were sort of, obviously their senses were heightened and they were paranoid and, very sort of on alert. So you almost had to really be that person in your head, to not act, to really feel that bad language and get all the lingo right, because people can sort of smell when things are wrong. And that would have been scary for you doing that work to start off.
Well, it was both, Bianca. It was frightening, but it was also incredibly exciting. And
it would have been when you were young.
And if any of your listeners have ever, I don't know, jumped out of an aeroplane with a parachute or abseiled down the side of a building or done something that really gives that massive download of adrenaline, they'd understand that what a rush adrenaline is. And we were living on adrenaline every day. So you're right. It was about becoming the person that you were portraying, but yet remembering to be on the side of the line that was right and not fall over the line to the other side.
Yeah. But also what was fascinating to me is that you were sort of put in those situations where you were forced to, obviously take certain drugs. So you would obviously still have to perform, do everything being high. And that, for me, that was really, I thought, geez, how do you do that? Especially if your body's not used to it.
Yeah, I'd never smoked a cigarette or had a drink in my life, let alone have a joint. So that was something that I'd made the decision to go along with, because I can't overemphasize how much I was focused on fighting the drug trade. So I was prepared to do those things because I thought at that stage of my life it was for the greater good. Yes. What I didn't understand was that lifestyle would actually become quite enjoyable for me. So I became very quickly very used to smoking dope and drinking, and I found that I was able to handle myself in that world much more capably than I ever thought I would have been. But it's still a challenge when you're sitting or dealing with a group of people in whether it be a bikie clubhouse or a pub or a house, and having a couple of joints and having a conversation about business and remembering what your cover story is.
Yeah.
And
Exactly.
and that's where the method acting came in.
But weren't you also forced to, in one situation, didn't someone have a gun on the table facing you saying you better take this or else you're going to blow your brains out?
Yeah, I went to buy some speed. And I guess the important thing too is that the real world in those days was nothing like the movies or television. We didn't have people watching our every move. We weren't carrying recorders. We weren't wired. Often we didn't have guns. I carried my gun maybe 70% of the time. So I went to buy some speed from a dealer that I'd met that day, and turned up to his flat in a part of Brisbane. When I knocked on the door, he was speeding. He was wired to his eyeballs, and I made the deal. Bought 2 grams of speed, and he insisted I stay and party with him. And I told him I didn't use it. At which point he produced a double-barrel shotgun, and I ended up doing 2 lines of speed with him, not voluntarily.
So is that they sort of test you like that to see if you are undercover? Because a lot of say, okay, if you take it, then maybe. But then
not in that
don't.
case.
Sorry.
No, there are not in that case. It was simply that he wanted someone to party with.
Yeah, okay.
And I happened to be there.
Yeah.
However, I'll be very careful what I say as far as any methodology that may still be used, but I certainly never used heroin. My approach was, like many good dealers, that I wasn't touching the product, I was making money out of it.
Yeah.
And once that was established, that was fine, because I tended then to buy quantities of heroin that weren't street level.
And it was interesting to me also, I mean, all of it makes sense when you explain it, but I think we don't really think of this sort of line of work too much in our everyday life. But just like when you said that you couldn't tell your work colleagues what you're really doing, like you couldn't tell anyone, because there could be certain cops, certain people that might want to leak something to someone, but you couldn't tell anyone, no one.
Yeah. I'm very open in the book about the corruption in Queensland, and I'm also very focused on the fact that the vast majority of policemen and women that I knew and worked with were honest and dedicated, without doubt. But there was certainly a cohort of corruption in that police force, and most of them were senior police. So it's worse. Well, any corruption is bad, but it's certainly worse when those who are taking money, selling drugs, setting up things, selling out jobs, are senior police. So both on a personal level and a professional level, I didn't tell anybody what I was doing. The only people I trusted were other undercovers.
Yes.
I mean, I was so extreme with that I was doing martial arts at the time, and I was training 4 or 5 days a week. And I told the people that I trained with, who weren't police, that I'd been kicked out of the police force because they found drugs in my locker. So for 2 years, they thought I was a disgraced cop. And that's just the price you pay.
Gee whiz. Yeah. But you definitely need, any person doing this line of work would need to talk to someone. And is that counselling? And I did also read that there wasn't that support back then. Back then, there was no such thing as, okay, there's counselling, there's support. It was just, you mentioned, people just went to the pub.
Yeah, there was no counselling was unheard of. Even later in my career, when I'd been involved in shooting situations, we had no counselling. So back in 1980 and 81 and 82, when I was doing the predominance of this undercover work, the only real support we had was each other. Yes. And undercover police, and as I've said in the book, police by nature of their occupation are isolated from the community, and that's the unfortunate real world. Cops see things that other people don't, thank God. But within the police force, who are isolationists by nature, undercover police are even more so, because undercovers are looked at, I won't say suspiciously by the police, but certainly undercovers don't live the normal cop life. So cops don't really know how to treat them. And as a result, we became our own little support network. Remembering, of course, we were only kids. We were 21, 22 and 23. With no supervision, living in the underworld, and and smoking dope and drinking like, you know, lunatics. And so that possibly came at a price. So as I say, the only support network we have were each other. And so we attacked that with vigor.
So do you think that if you started this line of work a decade later, you still would have done it, or 2 decades later?
Probably not 2 decades later. Certainly within the decade, the police force started to recognise the impact of the job on undercover police. I was actually one of the first instructors on an undercover police course that was designed and delivered in the late 1980s.
Okay.
I think that there was still there were certainly still police officers who experienced a lot of traumatic life undercover then. 2 decades later, no. The whole undercover situation has changed. It's much more controlled. Yeah. There are drug tests, there's counselling, there's support, there's psychological evaluation.
Drug tests.
And absolutely, yeah.
So they don't take anything when they're doing the work, like, you know, you said someone said to you to do it because they had a gun there.
Well, in that situation, in that situation, we had no backup. Without, and again, I've been out of policing for a long time, so I can't comment on how it happens now.
Yeah.
But certainly then we were really just thrown into the deep end, and we made do as we went along.
Interesting. Gee whiz. The mind boggles on this topic. Look, it's a really fascinating read. I'll just hold the book up for the listener and viewer. And your undercover name was Jim?
Yeah, Jim, in the operations I've written about. Remembering, of course, I was doing this work for 2 years, so I couldn't write about every operation I'd been involved in or with. That would have taken 5 books. But certainly, Jim was a name I used a lot because my second name is James. And so one of the tricks is to have a name that you actually answer to. And ironically, I remember coming home from an operation. I'd been away out of town for 3 or 4 months, and my flatmate called me by my real name, and I didn't answer him because it didn't register with me.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, always on edge and aware of all of that. Oh my gosh. What about it was interesting, just as a side, a small thing, the ham, cheese, tomato thing. I'd never heard of that before. The ham, cheese, tomato. They still use that term now, or?
Yeah, they do.
80s,
yeah.
90s thing.
Yeah, no, it was in Victoria, they call it the hamburger with the lot.
Yeah, that's right.
In Queensland, it was ham, cheese and tomato. And for the listeners, that means a street offence arrest is generally assault police or obscene language, assault police and resist arrest. I know that obscene language in a public place is not police now. Times have changed, but that's the way that policing dealt with a lot of street violence in the day. And even though the level of violence has changed in society now, back in those days it was pretty rough and ready. People wanted to punch a cop, essentially.
Yeah.
So the ham, cheese and tomato was an arsenal that was used to deal with those troublesome miscreants.
And Brisbane, getting back to Brisbane, it wasn't a safe place, was it, back then?
No, it wasn't. It was a pretty rough town, and to add to the challenges, I suppose, as a detective later, it became apparent that not all people with a badge could be trusted either.
Yeah.
So we lived a life where we found our own kind, as it were. So honest police would actually gravitate to those who are honest.
Yeah.
And again, just to reinforce the point, though, that the corruption was limited, I think, to certain areas, and certainly the drug squad was one. And I've written very openly about that.
Yeah, I do recall you saying in the book as well, you could tell that some cops were into different things with looking at their watches.
Yeah, that was one example. A very expensive watch, when the average salary for a detective senior constable was about 28 grand a year. That was pretty much out of place. Or expensive suits, and that's what people do when they have money. They actually don't realise that they're probably showing it off, I guess.
Yeah. So have you got to the point where you've reconciled everything within yourself with the work that you did? Because sort of at some point in the book, you did mention that you did have certain feelings of guilt with, I did write it down. What you say, you talk about the guilt that you felt at just certain times doing the job with regards to Sally and that sort of thing. You know, how long did that take to get over, or if you did, all that sort of thing?
Yeah, I came to terms with that after I left Undercover, actually. But so it's a human being, for a human being to befriend another, understanding that the ultimate goal is to betray them is quite challenging and quite a difficult thing to do.
Yeah.
And I met some people in that undercover world, in that criminal world, I guess, who I quite liked, who from a personality perspective, I really meshed with. And I had to remind myself often that they were breaking the law. And I don't mean selling a bag of pot. I mean, selling heroin and destroying people's lives. So, you know, I had to remind myself of that. But there were certainly some people that that were busted as a result of my activities. I felt quite bad for.
Yeah.
Yeah. And you know, sometimes you have to work through that as a human being and realize that you know, sometimes you don't have a choice.
Yes, of course. And that's the nature of the work. That's the work you were doing.
That's right. And it's a common thing, Bianca, amongst every undercover I've spoken with. And as I indicated before, I was an instructor on an undercover course, and I'd speak with undercover police, and we all shared that same challenge. It's actually betraying someone. And that's a tricky thing to get your head around.
And didn't some people also have a similar upbringing to yourself, so you could sort of empathize with them as well?
Yeah, absolutely. And there, for the grace of God, may have been me. And that certainly on more than one occasion hammered home with me that, you know, I'd be buying drugs from someone thinking, wow, you know, I actually understand you more than you realize.
Yeah.
And that's one of the challenges of life, isn't it?
Absolutely. Well, I urge people to read this book. It's absolutely fantastic. So there it is once again. Anything else you'd like to share with the listeners, Keith, before we say goodbye?
Yeah, thanks, Bianca. I just, I guess one of the other things that I'd love people to think about is next time they see a uniformed cop in a car, please understand that the job is not just about writing traffic tickets, that there are many, many facets to policing. And they are what stand between us and predators, and that's the cold hard reality, I guess. But just remember that they're human beings, and they may not be looking at you; they may be talking about what they had for dinner on Saturday night.
Exactly. Yeah, it's so relevant that you say that. Also, with what's been going on the past few months too, globally, with you know, the attitudes towards police, especially in the United States. Thank God, it's we're all okay here. Still, and hopefully it stays that way, because we need the police force. We need police to be there for us, and they're very brave people. 99% of them are doing the right thing and brave.
Yeah, absolutely. And the, you know, the reality is that if you have any organisation of people, there will be a percentage who do the wrong thing, without doubt. And I don't defend any police that do the wrong thing. But it's a vexed question in the States. You know, people over there have access to automatic weapons, and there are a lot of police murdered in the line of duty.
Yeah.
There's no easy answer to that one, unfortunately. I just...
And sadly, it has become, a lot of people sort of saying that it has become political, sadly.
Yeah, it has. It has. It doesn't help the average cop who's out there every night, you know, potentially pulling someone over who's got an automatic weapon. So it's, yeah, we're not there yet, thank God. But certainly, you know, it's just a societal attitude, I guess. No one likes being told what to do. But, you know, police are human beings, and they do it because the vast majority of them want to do the right thing and serve the community. So, yeah, that's what I'd like to leave the listener with. But certainly, you know, if they read the book, it's raw, it's open, nothing's hidden. There are some funny stuff in it, but it certainly has a message as well.
Yeah, fantastic read. Thank you, Keith, so much for joining us.
Appreciate your time, Bianca. Thank you.
Thank you.
Cheers.